My Facebook account is not at all linked to my YouTube channel. I hardly use Facebook anyway. My Facebook has my real last name, and I think I last posted to it like 6 years ago. But I still open it every now and then. Mostly just for memes and to see how my family and friends are doing. But I am actually friends with a couple like Catholic apologists and content creators and stuff like that on Facebook as well. Around 2 months ago, at the time of me writing this script, I saw a Facebook post from one of my favorite Catholic apologists, Suan Sonna. In fact, I like Suan so much that I don't think that I even want to use the term apologist to describe him. Let me show you what I mean. In a Facebook post from May of 2024, Suan wrote the following. On the one hand, I love the work of philosophical theologians and apologists in defending the rationality of Christianity. On the other hand, when you place the texts of Scripture in their proper historical context, you can't help but see that they come from a world that's strange and foreign to us, that doesn't care about being rational by our standards. Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity chimed in the comments section, writing, I think that a lot of that just depends on what's meant by rationality. To which Suan replied with a list of things that occur in Scripture that moderns probably view as pretty irrational, but the ancients didn't. The ancients thought it was normal. Suan replied, the image of God. We conceive of this as the human capacity for reason. A case can be made that Genesis is saying that we literally look like or are made ontologically in the form of deity. Temple sacrifices, we conceive of these as merely offerings to God, but a case can be made that the offering of animals to God is meant to feed him. God's body. We conceive of this language in the Bible as metaphorical, which I think is right, but it seems as if some of the ancient Israelites actually thought that God was made of some kind of supernatural matter, and so could be physically present and seen in this world, like showing his side to Moses. Other gods, some ancient manuscripts of the Psalms seem to say that God has placed other gods over other peoples, and anointing. This is a fun one in my Messianism class. The idea seems to be that oil, due to its shininess, appearing divine or godlike, is supposed to deify the king. And he's supposed to, and he is possessed by God or some spirits. Someone else in the comment section under that post said, hence the value of apologetics. We have questions and concerns that arise out of our context, which are to some degree foreign to the authors of Scripture. And Suan's reply was, I think apologetics has value in correcting overly skeptical trends and ensuring people give Christianity its fair due. On the other hand, apologetics/apologists need to know when not to oversell their case or overplay their hand. This is what I really respect about Suan, among other things, of course, his epistemic humility. One of my biggest gripes with Catholic apologists is that, at least the more apologist types, they are the least epistemically humble people out there. They know, with a capital K, that they have the capital T truth. The church cannot err. The church is the one true church that Jesus founded. These statements are really rather bold, rather proud. And I think that apologists would do well in following Suan's example here in expressing some epistemic humility. For the rest of this video, I'm going to pull examples from texts that are strange and foreign to us and that don't care about being rational by our standards. But instead of pulling those texts from the canon of the Catholic Bible, I'm going to pull them from the writings of the Church Fathers. Then I will end with a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas that will hopefully inspire a little bit of epistemic humility in the heart of the apologist, but we'll see. Let's get into it. I am going to present two different categories of ways in which the ancients just kind of thought differently than we do today. The first being odd reasoning, and the second being superstitious beliefs, with a focus on necromancy. One thing at a time. I will start with what I am calling odd reasoning. My first example of how the ancients just really didn't think like us, how they used reasoning that just kind of seems like really odd to a modern person, is going to come from St. Irenaeus. Brief background. St. Irenaeus was writing in the second half of the 2nd century. The work that we'll be looking at today is called Against Heresies and was written around 180 AD, and St. Irenaeus died right around the year 200. St. Irenaeus was the first person to call the Gospels by name, like as in the Gospel according to Matthew and the Gospel according to Mark and Luke and John. Before him, all the Christian writers were quoting from the Gospels, but kind of treating them like they were all interchangeable and referring to them as either like the Gospel of the Lord or just the words of the Lord or something like that. Even the first line of Mark says, the Gospel of the Lord. But anyway, in Irenaeus' time, the biblical canon had not yet been established. So in Against Heresies, St. Irenaeus is talking about which Gospels are canonical and which ones are not. And hey, how many Gospels can even possibly be canonical anyway? What is the upper limit on the number of Gospels that we can accept? Well, St. Irenaeus answers in Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 11, Section 8. It is not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than they are. For, since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live, and 4 principal winds, while the church is scattered all throughout the world, and the pillar and the ground of the church is the gospel and the spirit of life, it is fitting that she should have 4 pillars. So you can see here that Irenaeus thinks that there can be no more or no less than exactly 4 Gospels. Why? Because there are 4 zones of the world. Sometimes that's translated as 4 corners of the world. And because there are 4 winds. Therefore, there must be 4 Gospels. This kind of reasoning probably seems pretty foreign to a modern audience. But in the 2nd century, this kind of reasoning was kind of normal. For another example of weird reasoning from the 2nd century, let's turn to Justin Martyr. Justin was writing a couple decades before Irenaeus, and he uses some really odd reasoning as well. Justin's first apology is essentially like a long letter to the Emperor of Rome saying, hey, we're not so different, you pagans and us Christians. So could you please stop like jailing and executing us without a trial? But in the first apology, chapter 19, Justin is trying to prove that his belief in the resurrection isn't so crazy after all. Justin writes, for let this now be said hypothetically. If you yourself were not such as you are now, and born of such parents and causes, and one were to show you human seed and a picture of a man, and you were to say with confidence that from such a substance, such a being could be produced, would you believe before you saw the actual production? No one will dare to deny that such a statement would surpass belief. In the same way, then, you are now incredulous because you have never seen a dead man rise again. But, as at first you would not have believed it possible that such persons could be produced from the small drop, and yet now you see them thus produced, so also judge that it is not impossible that the bodies of men, after they have been dissolved, and, like seeds resolved into the earth, should, in God's appointed time, rise again and put on corruption. I guess that the resurrection of a person from the dead, according to Justin, is like equally as crazy as the fact that humans reproduce sexually. I mean, the fact that persons can be produced from such a small drop it's so insane, according to Justin, that, yeah, coming back from the dead maybe isn't so insane in comparison. I think that to a modern audience, this sounds kind of nuts, pun intended. But we know that nothing supernatural happens during sexual reproduction, and we understand what egg cells are. We understand a lot more about fetal development than we did 2,000 years ago. So we don't think that just because humans reproduce sexually, something supernatural has to be happening, and therefore, because something supernatural happens during birth, then like all supernatural stuff is fair game. No, we don't think like that. But I guess if you just didn't know any of that stuff, maybe Justin's not so crazy given, the state of the knowledge of sexual reproduction at that time. But that leads me to the next topic. Beyond odd reasoning, and that would be supernatural beliefs in general. It seems like even the most well-educated people in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd and 4th century ancient Near East held like supernatural beliefs that we today would think are kind of crazy, beliefs like necromancy. Let's start with St. Augustine, who wrote a book called The City of God Against the Pagans in the early 5th century as a response to the growing accusation that the reason for the fall of the Roman Empire was the rise of Christianity and the ousting of the pagan ideals. So St. Augustine wrote City of God as kind of like Rome wasn't flourishing because it was pagan. Rome was flourishing despite its being pagan. Paganism kind of sucks. That's what City of God is kind of like in a nutshell. Obviously, I'm like super oversimplifying, but we're going to zoom into book 7 of City of God, chapters 34 and 35. In chapter 34, Augustine brings up the second king of Rome, Numa Pompilius. Augustine says that Numa Pompilius wrote a book with such dark magic in it that Numa himself didn't want anyone to find the book, so Numa buried it. After Numa's death, a farmer found it and brought the book before the Senate. When the Senate read what was in the book, they promptly ordered it burned. Then in chapter 35, Augustine says that King Numa Pompilius learned this dark magic from demons by using hydromancy, which Augustine says is essentially the same thing as necromancy because in both cases, the dead are supposed to foretell things. Augustine goes on to say that, wherefore the things which are written in those books were either abominations of demons, or they were nothing else than the accounts of dead men, whom, through the lapse of ages, almost all the Gentile nations had come to believe to be immortal gods. While those same demons were delighted even with such rites, having presented themselves to receive worship under pretense of being those very dead men whom they had caused to be thought immortal gods by certain fallacious miracles performed in order to establish that belief. So, according to Augustine, hydromancy does work. But it doesn't work because paganism is true, but rather it works because demons are impersonating the souls of the dead that are seen in the water. Or those souls that are seen in the water really are the souls of the dead, but the pagans are just dumb enough to think that those souls of the dead are gods. When they're not gods, they're just the souls of the dead. And either way, the demons are delighted because hydromancy keeps people pagan and keeps them from becoming Christian. When you read chapters 34 and 35, it seemingly never occurs to Augustine that hydromancy and necromancy don't work. It seems a given. Of course hydromancy is real. How else do we get our portents of things to come? And this just kind of seems like super alien to the modern sensibility, right? Like we moderns would be quick to dismiss hydromancy. But Augustine takes it as a given that hydromancy works, it's effective. He just thinks that the demons or the souls of the dead are in the water, not pagan gods. Augustine isn't the only one who believes in necromancy either. Going back a couple hundred years to Justin Martyr's first apology again, in which Justin is trying to prove to the Roman emperor that the pagans and the Christians, we're not so different, you and I. He says, look, we Christians think that we go to heaven. And that's not so crazy. Like, look, pagans, I know that you guys generally think that, like, the soul, after it leaves the body in death, the soul isn't really the same person anymore. It's kind of like a shadow of who you were as a person. And the souls of the dead probably don't have any, like, real sensation or anything like that, because sensation, like, you need your body for sensation and all that. But we Catholics, we do think that we will feel sensation in heaven, and that's not so crazy. We're not so different, pagans, you and I. You might think that we're different because you don't think that souls have sensation after death, but we do think that souls have sensation after death. And why are we not that different? Because you guys do necromancy, and for necromancy to work, which it clearly does, souls have to have some kind of sensation to know that they're being contacted, to speak with you, and to give the portents of the future. In chapter 18 of the First Apology, Justin writes, "For let even necromancy, and the divinations you practice by immaculate children, and the evoking of the departed human souls, and those who are called among the magi, dream senders, and assistant spirits, and all that is done by those who are skilled in such matters, let these persuade you that even after death, souls are in a state of sensation. And those who are seized and cast about by the spirits of the dead, who all call demoniacs or madmen, and what you repute as oracles." And so he's listing all these things that pretty much, look, this is proof that souls have feeling. They have a state of sensation even after death. This passage shows again that belief in necromancy and divinations and the evoking of departed souls was just common enough practice back then that Justin Martyr is kind of saying, like, please don't kill us without a trial. You don't do the same thing to all the necromancers in your midst. And Christians and necromancers, we're kind of the same, dude, so please don't kill us. Okay, let's do one more just because I find the Christian belief in necromancy to be, like, super fascinating. There are works of literature that are referred to as Clementine literature, which are purported to be written by the first century writer, Pope St. Clement of Rome, but were actually probably written over 100 years after Clement was already dead. But regardless, these early Christian writings were held in high esteem, and the writer of these works does claim to be Clement of Rome, and nobody seemed weirded out by the fact that this person who claimed to be Clement of Rome believed that necromancy totally works. In the Recognitions of Clement, Book 1, Chapter 5, Pseudo-Clement, the author of Clement, is telling us about how before he was a Christian, he wanted to prove to himself that there is indeed life after death. In Chapter 4, Pseudo-Clement says, "For if after death I shall be no more, my present torture is useless. But if there is to be for me life after death, let us keep for that life the excitements that belong to it." So he's saying, like, if there's nothing, then I should just despair. But if there is life after death, then maybe I don't have to despair. Then in Chapter 5, Clement comes up with a plan to test and see that if after death we shall be, or we shall be no more. In Chapter 5, Clement writes, "What then shall I do? This I shall do. I shall proceed to Egypt, and there I shall cultivate friendship of the hierophants and the prophets who preside at the shrines. Then I shall win over a magician by money, and entreat him by what they call the necromantic art to bring me a soul from the infernal regions, as if I were desirous of consulting it about some business. But this shall be my consultation, whether the soul be immortal. Now, the proof that the soul is immortal will be put past doubt, not from what the soul says or from what I hear, but from what I see. For seeing it with my eyes, I shall be ever after hold the surest conviction of its immortality, and no fallacy of words or uncertainty of hearing shall ever be able to disturb the persuasion produced by the sight." Notice that Clement explains that he already knows that necromancy would prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that there is life after death. Necromancy works, and the idea that maybe necromancy doesn't work was never really in question. He's kind of saying to himself, I know that this will prove to me. It's like saying, like, if I want to prove to myself that something will fall, then I'll pick up something and I'll drop it and I'll watch it fall. I already know it's going to fall. And in the same way, Pseudo-Clement here is saying, like, hey, I want to convince myself that there is life after death, and so all that I need to do is go to a necromancer, and they're going to be able to conjure up a spirit for me, and then I'll know that there's life after death. I think that this is just super weird, right? Because I'm like a post-Enlightenment person. I'm a modern, right? I was born in 1995. I don't think this is that weird, though, to somebody born in the 1st or the 2nd or the 3rd or the 4th century. Maybe for a lot of human history, this wouldn't have been weird. But it is weird to us. And that brings me to the end of this video and kind of the whole point. In the introduction, I mentioned that I would be ending on a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas. And I am, but first let Cardinal Cupich quote St. Thomas Aquinas. "To one who has faith, no explanation is necessary. To one without faith, no explanation is possible." Now, that's a pretty loose paraphrase of what Aquinas really said. Obviously, Aquinas was writing in Latin, so any English translation is not exactly what Aquinas wrote. But here is a much more accurate translation of Aquinas's Latin, and you'll be able to tell that to one who has faith, no explanation is necessary. To one without faith, no explanation is possible. It's like a very loose paraphrase. So this comes from the Summa, question 1, article 5, and it's the reply to objection 1. Objection 1 says, "It would seem that those things of faith can be the object of science." And the reply is, "Unbelievers are in ignorance of things that are of faith, for neither do they see or know them in themselves, nor do they know them to be credible. The faithful, on the other hand, know them, not as by demonstration, but by the light of faith, which makes them see what they ought to believe." I think that the paraphrase used by Cardinal Cupich is a fine paraphrase of the real quote. It's accurate enough to the original, I think, and it's a hell of a lot more catchy. It's also all over the internet if you just Google like best Aquinas quotes or something. So I'll forgive Cardinal Cupich for the loose paraphrase, but either way you look at it, the more full translation or the catchier phrase, Aquinas seems to be making an admission that might make a lot of the more apologetic apologists blush. Catholic beliefs are sometimes just simply beyond the pale, so to speak. Beliefs that can only be believed through faith. If Justin Martyr was convinced that necromancy works, and he thinks that a man rising from the dead is no less unlikely than a man, being born through sexual reproduction, then I don't think that we should necessarily place too much stock in Justin's opinions about supernatural phenomena. In the beginning of Justin's first apology, he names the Roman emperor and then the Roman emperor's sons. I'm quite happy to believe Justin that the emperor really had those two sons or whatever. But when it comes to his beliefs about supernatural things like necromancy and things like the resurrection, I'm not certain that we should put too much stock in Justin's opinions. And the same should be said of Irenaeus and Pseudo-Clement and Augustine. And I hope that apologists keep this in mind, that they keep in mind how the ancients just really didn't have access to the same tools that we use to justify belief today, like the scientific method. Empiricism and pragmatism, they simply wouldn't come onto the scene for like another 1,000 years after Pseudo-Clement and Justin and Irenaeus and Augustine were writing. So it's not fair to hold the ancients to that standard, because that standard didn't exist back then. But I do hold myself to that standard because we today don't have the same excuses that the ancients did. We do have access to these tools like pragmatism and empiricism. And I think that this is partially why we're seeing the highest rates of defection from religion in the history of the human race now, broadly speaking. Let's let the ancients rest, leaving the past in the past, and instead let's hold ourselves to a higher standard. I look forward to what the future holds. Thanks all. And just for fun, why don't we dive a little bit into Catholic Reddit? So I decided to take this entire script and essentially just post it to the subreddit Catholic Philosophy, just to see if I could get any feedback that I could incorporate into my script. And I did actually. In my actual write-up, I used a language that I realized was just way too strong. Like I said something like we shouldn't really care what Justin Martyr has to say because he believes in necromancy. And I realized no, that's not the right way to phrase things. We should care what Justin has to say when it's things that aren't like incredible, right? Like that the Emperor of Rome had a name and that he had two sons. Like that's totally fine. I think it's fine to trust Justin on that. But should we trust Justin when he talks about necromancy? Probably not. So I actually did modify my script a little bit based off of the feedback that I received from this post. But I also received some really, really weird responses. So, and maybe I should just reiterate kind of like the point of my video. The point of my video was not like, haha, look at like these dumb ancient people. No. I think that the ancients did the best that they could with the tools that they had available to them, and it's just that the tools that they had available to them weren't as good as the tools that we have today. That's why we don't believe in necromancy today, but they did back then. Well, I thought that I did an all right job expressing that, but a lot of the comments here were pretty wild, and you can see here that the most upvoted comment is, honestly, none of these things are weird to me. They all make a reasonable amount of sense. And I said, really? Hydromancy? Speaking with the dead through reflections in sacred water makes it a reasonable amount of sense to you? And it didn't take long for this weirdo to start talking about like transgender issues and abortion. And then let's see if I can find it. But at some point, he starts talking about how AI is yeah, here we go. He goes, maybe people aren't communicating through sacred waters, but they are communicating with demons through tarot cards and things like AI, or even just praying to false gods. And I said, sorry, AI? You think AI is demonic? And then he linked a video, and like, you know, I'll go like this, and I'll open link in a new tab, and look who it is. It's Kennedy Hall. So like, okay, this is Catholic philosophy, I guess, is linking to YouTube videos from Kennedy Hall. So yeah, that was frustrating. That being said, there were a lot of good responses. So here, this guy, Neo-Federalist, I engage with him like a lot, and I really like him, and I think he's really thoughtful. And he says, yeah, Irenaeus' justification for the 4 Gospels is obviously ad hoc. If there was only 3, he could easily say, like, you know, there's a Trinity, just like God is a Trinity, so the Gospels are a Trinity, or whatever. And then Neo-Federalist says, but if we're being consistent, if we're holding ourselves to that higher empirical process, what kind of scientific method would you propose to answer the question of how many Gospels are divinely inspired? And I said, there is none. There is no such thing as an empirical process that can reveal the number of divinely inspired Gospels. And I said, this is where I think that the Eastern Catholics and the Orthodox shine in their comfort with the mysterious. I think that the kind of Catholic Answers brand apologists are trying to have their cake and eat it too, in the sense that they are trying really hard to like do the empirical thing, to do the rationalist thing, to do the like, you know, I'm only going to believe things that we have evidence for. And look, you know, Justin Martyr gives us strong evidence to think that, like, you know, we have good reason to think that, you know, Jesus of Nazareth really did rise from the dead. And then you actually read Justin Martyr, and he is not at all concerned with like the empirical process, right? Because like it just didn't exist back then. The ancients seem to be very okay with ad hoc reasoning. Their logic is funny. They have all of these supernatural beliefs. And I think that the apologist types would do well to admit as such, to kind of stop trying to have their cake and eat it too, and to kind of do the Eastern Catholic and Orthodox thing of just kind of like, yeah, man, like I believe this stuff. You know, it's because I believe it because I've had an encounter with the divine. I can't really explain it to you. You're gonna have to like encounter the divine yourself, and then you'll understand. Cool. Like I'm down with that. Yeah, I guess it just kind of rubs me the wrong way when the apologetics industrial machine tries to, you know, have their cake and eat it too. Okay. Thanks for hanging out with me for a couple extra minutes in the postscript. Just thought I would show you this Reddit write-up. I'll link to the whole Reddit write-up, I guess, in the comments if you want to see my script in written form. And thanks for hanging out. See you next time.